They told people it was their duty. Posters appeared on street corners, newspapers repeated the message, and speakers shouted it from public stages. Your country needed you. If you couldn't fight on the battlefield, you could fight with your wallet. Saving your money was no longer just personal responsibility, it was patriotism. But behind the speeches and the flags was a financial idea that would quietly reshape the modern world. A system where citizens didn't just defend their countries, they financed them. Welcome to a story where history, psychology, and money intersect. A story about how governments discovered that the most reliable lender in the world wasn't a bank or a king, it was the public. A war no one could afford. In World War I, Europe erupted into conflict unlike anything the world had seen before. This was not a medieval battle with swords and horses. It was industrial war. Factories produced artillery shells by the millions, railways moved armies across continents, steel ships and early tanks consumed enormous resources. Every day of fighting burned through mountains of money. Governments quickly realized something terrifying. They didn't have enough. For centuries, nations had funded wars using gold reserves, taxes, and loans from powerful bankers. But modern warfare was simply too expensive. The gold stored in national vaults began disappearing faster than governments expected. Leaders faced a dangerous choice: raise taxes and risk public revolt, or find another way to get money from their citizens. They chose something new, something surprisingly clever. They turned debt into patriotism. The birth of the war bond. Instead of forcing citizens to give money through taxes, governments asked people to lend it. The idea was simple. You would buy a bond from the government today. After the war ended, the government promised to repay you with interest. In theory, it sounded like a safe investment. In practice, it was a brilliant psychological strategy. In Britain, posters appeared on streets with soldiers staring directly at passers-by. Your country needs your savings. In Germany, citizens lined up outside banks to purchase national war loans. But the most dramatic campaign happened in the United States. When America entered the war in 1917, the government launched massive promotions for what it called Liberty Bonds. Famous actors spoke at rallies, musicians performed at public events. Even school children were encouraged to save coins to buy bonds. Buying one wasn't presented as a financial decision, it was presented as a moral act. If you loved your country, you would invest in its victory. And millions of people did. The promise and the problem. On paper, these bonds looked like a good deal. You gave the government money now. Later, you received your money back plus interest. But there was a hidden detail that few people considered. The value of money can change. During and after the war, governments printed enormous amounts of currency to keep their economies running. Prices began rising. Food became more expensive. Clothing cost more. Housing costs increased. This phenomenon is known as inflation, and inflation quietly erased much of the value those bonds promised. Imagine someone bought a bond for $100. Years later, the government repaid exactly $100 plus a small amount of interest. But by that time, prices had doubled. That same $100 could only buy half of what it once did. Technically, the government kept its promise, but in reality, the lender had lost wealth. Europe's financial aftershock. Across Europe, the consequences were even more dramatic. In Britain, war loans paid interest that seemed attractive during the conflict, yet rising prices gradually destroyed much of their real value. In Germany, the situation became catastrophic. After the war ended, the country experienced one of the worst episodes of inflation in history. This crisis is remembered as the German hyperinflation of 1923. Money became so worthless that people carried it in baskets. Savings disappeared almost overnight. Many citizens who had proudly purchased war bonds watched their investments become nearly worthless. They had supported their nation, but their financial security had vanished. A new kind of power. Despite the losses experienced by ordinary citizens, governments learned something important. War bonds worked. They raised enormous amounts of money quickly. In the United States alone, bond campaigns raised tens of billions of dollars. That was enough to fund a large portion of the country's war effort. More importantly, governments realized they could mobilize public money using emotion rather than force. Instead of demanding payment through taxes, they could appeal to pride, fear, and loyalty. Debt became a national project. The bond market was no longer limited to bankers and elites. It now included millions of everyday people, and that changed finance forever. Debt that lasted a century. When the war ended, governments faced another challenge. They owed huge amounts of money to their own citizens. Paying it all back quickly would have been impossible, so many governments used a different strategy. They refinanced the debt. In Britain, some war loans were converted into long-term government securities known as consols. These bonds paid interest for decades without ever fully maturing. The system allowed the government to spread repayment across generations. Remarkably, some of the debt created during World War I was not fully retired until 2015, nearly 100 years after the war ended. The idea that never disappeared. When World War II began 2 decades later, governments already knew exactly what to do. The bond campaigns returned, but this time they were bigger, louder, and more polished. In the United States, Hollywood joined the effort. Famous actors promoted bonds in theaters and on radio broadcasts. Cartoon characters appeared in advertisements encouraging families to save money for victory. Buying bonds became part of everyday life, and once again, millions of citizens funded the war. From war financing to modern finance. After the war, the system didn't disappear. Instead, it expanded. Government bonds became the foundation of global finance. Banks held them. Pension funds invested in them. Foreign governments purchased them as reserves. The bond market grew into one of the largest financial systems on Earth. What began as a desperate wartime tool became a permanent feature of the global economy. Today, government debt supports everything from infrastructure to social programs. The language has changed. Instead of war bonds, we hear terms like treasury securities, sovereign debt, and recovery bonds. But the principle remains similar. Governments borrow money today and promise repayment tomorrow, and the public continues to believe in those promises. The psychology behind it all. The true genius of the war bond system was psychological. It linked financial decisions with national identity. Buying government debt became more than an investment. It became an expression of loyalty. Questioning the system sometimes felt like questioning the country itself. That connection between emotion and finance proved extremely powerful, because as long as people trust the system, governments can continue borrowing. The numbers matter, but belief matters more. The legacy of the war bonds. More than a century has passed since the first large-scale bond drives of World War I, yet their influence is still visible today. Modern economies operate on enormous amounts of government debt. Markets depend on it, institutions rely on it, and citizens, often without realizing it, remain part of the system that began during those early wartime campaigns. What started as an emergency financial tool became the backbone of modern finance. The war may have ended, but the mechanism it created never disappeared. If this story made you see history from a different angle, remember that the past often hides inside the systems we use every day. And sometimes, the most powerful ideas in the world aren't weapons, they're financial promises.